She wasn't a killer. She was a wife, a mother, a pillar in her community. But one morning in November 1989, everything changed. She crept into his bedroom, a .38 caliber revolver in her hand. 2 shots, then 2 more, and in the silence, she walked out, turned herself in, and the country couldn't look away. This is the story of Betty Broderick. A story of love, betrayal, rage, and justice. For almost 2 decades, she stood by him, supported his dreams, raised their family, even backed the law firm that made him wealthy. Until he left her for a younger woman. So she did what she believed was necessary. She took back everything he had taken from her. This isn't just a crime, it's a reckoning. Before the headlines and before the trial, there was just Betty. Born Elizabeth Ann Bisceglia on November 7th, 1947, in Bronxville, New York. Betty was the 3rd of 6 children in a strict Roman Catholic family. Her mother taught her that a woman's duty was simple: support your husband, raise your children, keep the family together no matter what. By the time she turned 17, that message was etched into her identity like scripture. She attended the College of Mount St. Vincent, majoring in early childhood education. Quiet, proper, traditional, but ambitious, in her own way. And then she met him, Daniel T. Broderick III, a charismatic medical student from Pittsburgh, confident, handsome, Catholic, Irish, everything her parents approved of. They married in 1969, barely out of college. On paper, they were perfect. But this wouldn't be a marriage of equals, not in the way Betty imagined. Dan had plans to become a doctor, then a lawyer. And Betty? Her job was to fund that dream. She worked part-time jobs, cared for their home, and raised their children as Dan enrolled in Harvard Law School. At one point, Betty worked 2 jobs to support them, even sold Avon on the side, all while raising toddlers in a cramped apartment. She mailed Dan his tuition checks, cooked his meals. She was his full-time secretary, wife and mother, all unpaid. By 1973, Dan graduated from Harvard and took a job at a top San Diego law firm. Money started flowing in, and with it, status. The Brodericks were climbing. They bought a beautiful home in La Jolla. They joined exclusive clubs. Dan opened his own malpractice law firm. Betty gave birth to 4 children: Kim, Lee, Daniel, and Rhett. By the early 1980s, they were one of the most admired families in San Diego's elite social circle. But beneath the manicured lawns and gala fundraisers, something was shifting. Dan was no longer the man who scribbled love notes on diner napkins. He became controlling, emotionally cold, dismissive. And Betty? She was aging, tired, and increasingly aware that she wasn't part of Dan's future plans anymore, just his past. And then, in 1982, she met the woman, Linda Kolkner, 21 years old, blonde, beautiful, hired as Dan's legal assistant. Betty noticed the glances, the quiet laughs behind closed doors, the missed dinners, the late hours. She asked. He denied, over and over again. But betrayal, like blood, has a scent. And Betty, she smelled it everywhere. By the mid-1980s, everything Betty feared and was becoming her reality. Dan was earning millions. He drove a black Corvette. He took meetings at exclusive country clubs. And always, by his side, Linda Kolkner, 21 years younger, former flight attendant, no legal background, but suddenly, his assistant. Betty asked again, "Is there something going on?" Dan denied it, every time. "You're imagining things," he'd say. "You're paranoid." Gaslighting became the norm. And Betty, the woman who once held the household together with her bare hands, was starting to fracture. One night she came home to find her wedding china gone. Dan had moved it, just like that. No explanation, no discussion. Soon after, Dan quietly filed for divorce. Without telling her, she found out through legal mail. He froze their joint bank accounts, cancelled her credit cards, changed the locks on their home, her home. She had no job, no legal education, no access to money, 4 children, and the man she built everything with was now erasing her, piece by piece. Betty began showing up at Dan's new home unannounced, sometimes screaming, sometimes crying. Once, she threw a stereo through a window. Another time, she spray-painted the walls of his house. Police were called, charges were threatened, but nothing ever stuck. Dan, with his legal connections and clean image, looked like the calm, rational parent. Betty? The unhinged, emotional ex. And that's exactly how the court saw her. Despite everything she gave, Betty was granted no spousal support. Dan was given full control of the assets. He even convinced the judge that Betty was mentally unstable, using her angry voicemails and confrontations as evidence. Betty was being erased from her own life, legally, financially, and emotionally. And then came the final insult. In April 1989, Dan married Linda. The affair was no longer a rumor. It was a headline, a ceremony, a wedding Betty was never meant to survive. They held the reception at the same country club Betty once attended. Friends she once dined with now toasted the woman who replaced her. Betty, watching from the outside, wasn't just heartbroken. She was humiliated and, in her mind, discarded. What she saw wasn't a divorce. It was annihilation, and she refused to disappear quietly. When Dan told her to stay away, she refused, because nothing had ever been hers to refuse. By 1985, Betty's life had become a blur of custody fights, frozen accounts, and deliberate exclusion. Dan moved on, marrying 21-year-old Linda Kulkener in April 1989, a youth verging on replacement. And Betty, she became relentless. She smashed his car with a hammer, drove her own through his front door, and spray-painted his house black. In one infamous incident, she hit a Boston cream pie and smeared it across Linda's bedroom, frosting on bed, clothing and floor, all his expensive belongings ruined. She broke mirrors, smashed chandeliers, shattered vases, and punctured stereo systems. Often police were called, but Dan's influence and public image kept her out of long-term trouble. Then came her weapon of voice. Hundreds of obscene voicemails left on Dan's home answering machine. She called Linda the whore, and the kids heard. Dan's response was weaponized. He fined her for every curse word, docked her support checks by $100 to $500 per infraction, and imposed steep fees for every unwanted visit or voicemail. He even sent a note showing she had gone minus £300 in a single month because of repeated infractions. Betty described those voicemails as her primal scream, the only voice she had left. But Dan wasn't done. In 1986, he began filing order to show cause motions, monthly court orders accusing Betty of every disruption, visit, or call she made. She was dragged to court time and again, humiliated publicly, expected to prove she hadn't broken the rules. Dan kept writing. When she showed up to pick up the children from his home, Dan blocked her. Frustrated, she literally drove her car through the front porch. She smashed windows and ripped the door off. She was arrested. Dan used it to claim mental instability, solidifying his control. The collateral damage extended to her children, exposed to vulgar messages, voicemails, and violence. The same kids who once trusted their mother were caught in the middle of her rage and his legal machinery. To the outside world, Dan became the picture of restraint, a calm professional wronged by a volatile ex. And that narrative worked in court. Judges granted custody to Dan, denied Betty spousal support, awarded him nearly everything, even though his behavior had shattered her life. The morning of November 5th, 1989 began like any other. But for Betty Broderick, it was the day everything changed. Just 2 days before her 42nd birthday, Betty purchased a Smith & Wesson .38 caliber revolver, a weapon she claimed she bought for protection. though a friend's testimony called it a weapon of her revenge. At around 5:30 a.m., she drove to 1041 Cypress Avenue in Marston Hills, San Diego, the home Dan and Linda had moved into after the divorce. With a key she took from her daughter Lee, she let herself in. Inside, Dan and Linda were asleep in their bedroom. She slowly crept in and fired. 2 bullets struck Linda, one in the head, one in the chest. She died instantly. Dan was hit next. A bullet to the chest as he reached for the phone, another to the back. One bullet hit the wall and another struck the nightstand. Medical examiners later revealed Dan didn't die instantly. He gasped, then whispered, "Okay, you shot me, I'm dead." Betty unplugged the phone and fled the room. Outside, she contacted her daughter Lee and Lee's boyfriend. Moments later, she surrendered to police, calm, unarmed, admitting the act. Linda was 28. Dan was 44, just 17 days shy of his 45th birthday. Her reasoning? She told investigators she hadn't planned the murder. She intended only to confront Dan and then kill herself in front of him. But when Linda screamed, she panicked and fired. In her first trial, October-November 1990, her defense argued battered woman syndrome. 10 jurors favored murder, 2 leaned manslaughter, resulting in a hung jury. By her second trial, in December 1991, the narrative shifted. The defense rested on temporary insanity. Prosecution depicted cold execution. This time, the jury found her guilty on 2 counts of second-degree murder and associated firearms charges. She was sentenced to 32 years to life, the maximum allowed. 2 bodies, 1 confession, but the question in court wasn't whether Betty Broderick did it. It was why. When the trial began in October 1990, the case divided the nation. One side saw a cold-blooded killer. The other, a woman pushed too far for too long. The courtroom was packed. Media outlets battled for seats. The Betty Broderick case wasn't just news, it was spectacle. Betty appeared in court wearing neutral suits, hair tied back, her face unreadable. But her voice told a different story. She cried, raged, laughed bitterly at Dan's betrayals, and sometimes she just stared ahead, blank. Her defense? That she was a battered woman, not in bruises, but in years of psychological and emotional cruelty. A woman gaslit, erased, and discarded by the man she built her life around. They introduced her voicemails as evidence of her unraveling, hundreds of tapes filled with profanity, threats, pain. But to Betty, those tapes were her only outlet. Her primal scream, she called them. The prosecution, however, painted a different picture. They said this wasn't about justice. This was revenge, premeditated and cold. She had options, the prosecutor said. She had a car, money, and a support system. She chose murder. The jury deliberated for days. But it wasn't enough. 10 wanted second-degree murder. 2 held out for manslaughter. It ended in a hung jury. In December 1991, she was retried. The tapes played again. Her children testified. Her daughter Kim recalled waking to hear her father had been killed. Her son, Danny, asked the judge not to send his mother to prison for the rest of her life. But the jury didn't budge this time. On December 11, 1991, Betty Broderick was found guilty of 2 counts of second-degree murder and sentenced to 32 years to life in prison. And the media went wild. Headlines splashed, "Till death do us part, divorce can be murder," from suburb to cell block. Daytime shows, late-night specials, true crime documentaries. They all picked up her story. But what they couldn't decide was if she was a victim or a villain. One New York Times columnist wrote, "In another era, Betty would have been institutionalized. In this one, she was televised." To many, Betty Broderick became a symbol of rage, of injustice, of a woman society failed to understand. Years passed, but the questions never left. Betty Broderick remains behind bars at the California Institution for Women. Her parole has been denied multiple times, in 2010, 2011, and again in 2017. Why? Because she showed no remorse. When asked by the board if she would do it again, she didn't say no. To some, that's chilling. To others, it's a sign of just how far gone she was, not from reality, but from a system that offered her no protection, no justice, no closure. Her children are split. 2 support her release, 2 refuse to speak to her. One of them, in a letter to the parole board, wrote, "My mother is a danger, not because she's violent, but because she refuses to believe she ever did anything wrong." Television, movies, interviews, books, they all came and went. But Betty's story stayed. Not because of what she did, but because of what she represented. She wasn't the first woman to be discarded. She wasn't the first to scream into the void, but she was one of the few who made the whole world listen, even if just for a moment. And still, the debate lingers. Was Betty Broderick a cold-blooded killer? Or the product of a life spent erasing herself to please others? Can someone be both? And if a system pushes someone far enough, do they become responsible for what they become? Or do we all share the blame? These aren't easy questions, but they're the kind we ask here. At Beyond Her Rage, where the stories of women who were silenced, blamed and broken finally get told. And where every scream, every tear, and every shattered truth is finally heard.